Michael Saylor makes a new, massive Bitcoin shock forecast. And this time, it has nothing to do with utopian Bitcoin prices, but is much, much more intense. Additionally, Hans-Werner Sinn says on live TV that the USA is on the brink of a national bankruptcy. And we need to take another look at the N2 money chart, which is currently going viral on social media, according to which Bitcoin is supposed to be catapulted up to $250,000. There are now tendencies towards this, that this chart is fake and there was a comma error here. But we also have very, very interesting developments otherwise. We see that now here at TREZOR, a betting portal, currently. The market's assessment is that we will rise to $127,000 this year. This is currently the market assessment, and the highest probability. And that is already very, very positive, that the market remains bullish here. And definitely assumes a Bitcoin price of nearly $130,000 this year. And then we need to look at this chart again. I already shared it in the video yesterday. Here you can see the M2 money supply breaking out massively. And Bitcoin, which then rises to nearly $250,000, with a 3-month delay. So we always see that Bitcoin is about 90 days behind the M2 money supply. And the M2 money supply has exploded mainly because the M2 money supply in India has exploded. However, there was apparently a bug with the M2 money supply from India. And apparently, there was a decimal error, so the M2 money supply was just shifted by a decimal point, and then there was simply a much too high money supply, reported here. And if we look at the fixed chart here, Bitcoin is indeed rising, not to $250,000, but only to around $160,000, $170,000. Zero Edge also shared another chart where Bitcoin will only rise to $130,000, $140,000. And the betting markets say that Bitcoin will rise to $130,000 or below $130,000. So we need to keep monitoring this. We know that the big indicator is simply that Bitcoin is always most tied to the M2 money supply. I was discussing this with my mother earlier. This was also a topic at the Swiss Bitcoin conference, because Shin Decree mentioned that all the indicators, all the big price drivers, strategic Bitcoin reserve, Donald Trump, and then this happens and then that happens, and the ETFs buy and so on, that all of that wouldn't be so relevant. Then we briefly discussed what really decisive price factors are, because he does have a point in certain aspects that he addresses here. I always report on a lot of things that happen, but that's also what I always say. If you should only look at one chart, then look at the M2 money supply. Of course, it's awesome when a strategic Bitcoin reserve comes. Of course, it's awesome when some external catalysts come. And then there's MicroStrategy. Now there's the new company from Jack Malice, and so on. These are all catalysts. But the most crucial thing is always the M2 money supply. There are also people who say, for example, that the halving cycles have relatively little impact. The crucial thing is the M2 money supply. The M2 money supply is always synchronized with the halving cycles because the halving always occurs in an election year. And in an election year, the M2 money supply always increases. Specifically in a US election year, it should be noted. Marty also gave an assessment on this. He says here, in my opinion, India's increase in the M2 money supply by $7 trillion US dollars is due to an oral agreement between the USA and India, which provides for the expansion of production as a new production partner of the USA. A new contract would be concluded with India. So that's his reasoning for why the money supply in India is rising so sharply. And of course, this also pumps up all the Bitcoin price forecasts here. Because we need to know, it's not just crucial what happens in the USA, in Europe, it's global. That means what happens in China, what happens in India. And if, of course, a major currency area becomes completely overinflated, it naturally has an impact on the Bitcoin price. But there was also a second very interesting take on this that someone wrote in the comments. Someone wrote, hey, what do countries do before they start initiating any conflicts here? So before they start engaging in military activities here? Then, of course, they start printing massive amounts of money. And this also represents what could potentially happen here. Yes, there have been conflicts between India and Pakistan. And I don't know how that will turn out. I'm not an expert or anything like that. But when we have such military conflicts, it always means my printer. And that's why military conflicts are often not as negative as one might think. That means, initially, they go. Of course, it goes down when there are conflicts, and when there is uncertainty. Also leads to money being printed, and this printing of money, in turn, causes asset prices to rise. So, it's a very, very perverse relationship that we actually have here. But now we come to the new Bitcoin shock forecast from Michael Saylor. Feel free to join in and think about what he has predicted this time. No, this time it has nothing to do with the Bitcoin price. We're not going up to 300 million in Bitcoin price, but it's something else. If you know, feel free to write it down in the comments below. There was a gathering, and it was at Bitwise. I hope there will be videos coming from it. There was a meeting, and several big personalities were invited. Michael Saylor, I believe Metaplanet was represented. All the Simmel Scientific, all the other big companies. So, I believe it was mainly about corporations, specifically companies that are investing in Bitcoin. And he made a very, very interesting thesis here. This is essentially an Excerpt from his speech. Eleanor Turek quoted this. The quote from Michael Saylor that he said here. And he says that BlackRock SIBIT will be the largest ETF in the world in 10 years. And that's really massive, what he's saying here. That means he actually believes that BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF will be the most massive ETF, with the largest capital flow, with the largest market capitalization. And they're already doing relatively well. I don't know where they are, but probably somewhere in the top 10. Or something like that, the EBIT should be. I don't know it by heart. If not already in the top 5 or so. But not that I'm being too bullish and it turns out not to be true. Write it in the comments if you know exactly where the EBIT is. And in the future, it will simply be that people, even when Bitcoin becomes a standard 0815 savings tool, then they naturally won't go into MSCI World or another ETF to save, but rather it's here. Bitcoin the 0815 savings vehicle. And Bitcoin then simply becomes the default savings tool here. And then you don't go into an MSCI World or a QQQ or something like that, but rather you go into a Bitcoin ETF. And that would be massive, of course. With that, a lot of indirect flows naturally come in. And with an ETF, it's often the case that the more massive it is, the more market capitalization and track record it has. That means it's often said don't go into an ETF that has too small a capital flow. Focus instead on the large ETFs. And often there are also winner-takes-it-all solutions. That means if we have, for example, 10 ETFs, one of them will prevail. We've seen this in many industries. There aren't even 3 ETFs competing at the top. Usually, exactly one winner emerges. And that one will then be the leading ETF. And according to Michael Saylor, this is very clear here. The EBIT ETF. Adam Beck makes a very interesting remark about this, and says here that MicroStrategy and other treasury companies, those doing something similar to MicroStrategy, like Jack Mallah's new company, 21 Capital, are Arbitrage of the dislocation between the Bitcoin future and today's fiat world. So arbitrage simply means trying to allocate your money where you see an advantage. And he compares the two worlds, the old world and now the new world. And then he says here, a sustainable and scalable trade worth 100 to 200 trillion US dollars, which drives hyperbitcoinization. And that's basically the arbitrage advantage you can gain here. That means if you now move your money from the old system to the new system, then you basically have an arbitrage advantage of 100 to 200 trillion. This means the Bitcoin price can easily increase 100-fold, and everyone can take advantage of this arbitrage now. Not only companies, but especially companies will take advantage of it because they go in leverage, making a speculative attack on the fiat money system. When talking about arbitrage, you might also need to somehow, pronounce the two systems together. I don't know if you can really talk about arbitrage if you're just putting your savings into Bitcoin. Arbitrage would probably mean more that you go into debt in one currency and use the borrowed money to get the good money. That means you try to incur as much debt as possible in the old system and bring as much money as possible into the new system without getting liquidated, without getting a margin call, and, of course, with smart leverage, and ideally with, a very good debt strategy. So, this is not a recommendation or anything. It's always a risk. But if a company can access very cheap loans, sometimes even at 0% or leverage with convertible bonds or other financial instruments, then it's certainly a very interesting story. He even adds here that the whole thing is scalable enough for most large, publicly traded companies to switch to Bitcoin treasuries. So this is, for example, such a very big statement that many people now understand that with your company, you can not only make money from the operational business, but you can also earn money with your treasury. And often, you would only lose money with your treasury. And now, really smart people like Michael Saylor or, for example, Adam Beck are coming along and telling you, hey, you can make massive money with the treasury by simply doing arbitrage trading here, just like you might have done arbitrage trading in the past. Okay, on one exchange, a coin might be lower, and on another exchange, the coin might be higher. And then you buy it on one exchange and sell it on the other. That's exactly how you do arbitrage trading now, but on a very large scale with the treasury strategy in the company. And takes the money from the fiat world, gets the fiat tokens here and swaps them into the new world, and buys with that. Here are the Bitcoin tokens. Now I've just arrived at the beach. Look, there's really black sand here. And it gets even better, because the beard I have here isn't professional enough yet. With the sand it looks much better, looks instantly better. So go ahead, and give a like for the ultimate Hitler Evil Bitcoin artwork here. Yes, and now let's take a look at a statement from Hans-Werner Sinn, Professor Dr. Hans-Werner Sinn. He sometimes has really cool takes. With some takes, I also think, what the heck is going on here again? But now he had a very interesting take on the USA and a potential US dollar collapse. Check this out.
And secondly, we can also do the following. We can impose a fee, as Americans, on the interest that we have to pay to the creditors. And if you combine both according to the definitions of the rating agencies, then it's basically insolvency. So they are openly playing with the topic of insolvency. In other words, America has lived beyond its means for so long that it is on the brink of bankruptcy. Now, of course, they will try to keep it legally below the threshold of formal bankruptcy. And so, pressure will be exerted on other countries, especially public entities, like their central banks, to take over American securities now. And this pressure must be generated through the threat of tariffs. That's the mechanism. So this is ultimately just the surface of what's happening. In truth, it's about this completely unresolved debt problem of the Americans towards the rest of the world.
So, what Hans-Werner Sinn actually said, Moneybringer, GoPro, means that no one wants US Treasury bonds anymore. That means they somehow have to figure out how to get rid of that junk. If no one buys it, then people have to be forced to take it. And if people won't take it even when forced, then we'll just have to turn on our own money printing press again. That's actually the common scenario. What will actually happen? So, printing money. And additionally, they would obligate some other countries to buy up the Treasury bonds, because the US also has the big problem that the yields on Treasury bonds are rising. And that's because no one wants the Treasury bonds anymore. Yesterday, I reported that Japan has now also confirmed to have likely sold very, very large holdings. You can definitely see that they have sold a lot of Treasury bonds. And China has probably done the same. And yes, that's definitely interesting. That now, even in the German mainstream, it's being discussed that the US is facing bankruptcy. I mean, bankruptcy is always a vague word. What does bankruptcy really mean? Bankruptcy would ultimately mean that there is hyperinflation or something like that, or simply that the currency devalues very, very strongly. And that would mean that Bitcoin appreciates again. That means everything that's happening right now, including the trade conflicts and such, and the devaluation of the US dollar, is exactly what Bitcoin has been talking about for years. Get yourself a safe haven. Get yourself some hard money, not debt money, because debt money will eventually go down the drain. It will eventually explode, and so on. And now more and more people are realizing this. And the more people realize it, the more people sell US Treasury bonds, and the more people stop participating in the scam. And that's very, very interesting. I mean, Hans Johann also made some strange comments, where he said we need the United States of Europe now. I mean, that's obviously nonsense. We don't need more of that. Centralized redistribution, centralized power, or something like that in Europe. But in any case, I found it a very, very interesting take that the collapse of the US dollar is being discussed here on public television. Now all that's missing is Bitcoin in the discussion, because you can't talk about the collapse of the US dollar on one hand and just ignore Bitcoin on the other. I'm curious when this will make it to lands and all of the big talk shows, and so on. Feel free to write your tips in the comments below. And if you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link below to French One Bitcoin, where you can easily and securely buy Bitcoin. And with the Bitcoin Hotel, you can get up to 20% off fees when buying Bitcoin, folks. See you, peace out.